We've seen all kinds of dirty dingleberries during the era of Congressional Dish, like the dingleberry that legalized bank bailouts of both foreign and domestic banks, or the treaty with Mexico that was approved via dingleberry that opened up huge parts of the Gulf of Mexico to deepwater oil drilling not long after the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And we routinely see things like spying provisions and other provisions from like the Patriot Act being renewed without any debate. And of course, there are so many corporate favors. And that's actually why I think there's no real incentive or attempt by the leaders of either party to fix the clearly broken appropriations process, because they can get things into law that benefit their corporate donors that would be controversial and much harder to pass on their own. Dysfunction in Congress has become a tactic.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 288th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And as I speak to you right now, it is 5 months and a few days into fiscal year 2024, and Congress has not appropriated funding for discretionary spending yet. We're currently operating under a continuing resolution, and this month's congressional agenda is going to be dominated by news and drama about the minibus bills that need to be signed by March 8th and March 22nd. And in this episode, I'm going to decode that congressional gobbledygook for you so that you can understand what all of that means. And so you'll be able to follow the developments yourself, both in real time here in March 2024 and in the future, because government funding crises have become a yearly tradition in this age of dysfunctional Congresses. And so today I'm going to give you an episode that's actually been requested many times, because I've talked about the government funding process before, but always just as a quick intro into an episode about one of our many government funding dramas. But this episode is one designed to be our government funding 101, so that you can share it no matter what year it is and what the current drama is. And I want you to be able to give this episode to your loved ones so that they can follow the drama themselves too. And so in this episode, I'm going to explain how the government funding process is supposed to work, and then I'll show you the telltale signs that something has gone horribly wrong. And in the process, I'm going to explain all of the DC wonky words that are used to describe all of this. Words that no normal person uses on a daily basis, and words that I actually do think are designed to make all of this seem much more complicated than it really is, so that fewer of us will pay attention. Because I think one of the main reasons why things have gotten so bad in Congress and why Congress is able to do things that are self-serving and don't serve their constituents, I think that's because so few of us pay attention. And I'd like to help change that in any way I can. And so I hope this episode helps. And if you find that you like and appreciate this episode existing, please pay whatever you think is fair using the options in this episode's show notes, which you can find on congressionaldish.com and often right in your podcasting app, because you're going to hear no advertisements today or ever on this podcast. And that's how you can trust that I'm telling you what I believe to be true at all times, because no politician or company is even allowed to pay me to say anything to you. We're all about building trust here. And trust me when I tell you that the government funding process is not as hard to understand as it may seem. So one of the words that you need to know is appropriations. Appropriations is the word for government funding. And government funding takes place in the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee, and on all of the subcommittees inside of those. Now, there's two different kinds of spending that one is dealt with in the appropriations process and one is not. So one kind of spending, which the Congress does not have to touch every year, is so-called mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is exactly what it sounds like. It's approved automatically and Congress doesn't have to do a thing. Thank God. Mandatory spending is about 60% of the money that the federal government spends, and it includes programs such as Medicare, Social Security, and some payments to state and local governments. Because mandatory spending is automatic, whenever we're in a government needs to be funded or else there's a shutdown situation, all of that drama is about the remaining 30% of government funding, the discretionary spending, as in it is spent at Congress's discretion every year. And in case you noticed that 60% mandatory plus 30% discretionary only equals 90%, well, that's because about 10% of our tax money is going to the bankers as interest on our national debt every year. But when I'm talking about government funding today, I'm going to be talking about discretionary spending. And the way that this process starts is every year in around February, whoever is president at the time is going to submit a budget proposal on behalf of the executive branch agencies. And one of the things that makes me absolutely nuts about these presidential budget requests is that so much media attention is paid to these every year. And one of the reasons that makes me crazy is that the president's budget proposals do not become law. The president in this process has only one necessary role, and that's signing whatever Congress presents to him into law. The president is the pen, and that's it. The rest is politics. And the president's budget proposal is essentially politics. It's the executive branch agency saying, this is what we want, and this is what we want it for. But Congress is free to totally ignore those requests, and often does. And so presidential budget requests are merely suggestions at the start of the process and can honestly be ignored. I ignore them because they will not affect your life in any real way. The real funding is done in Congress, specifically in the House of Representatives, if all of this is going the way it should. And this is because Article 1 of the Constitution says that, quote, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills, unquote. The idea behind this was to ensure that the part of Congress most directly responsive to the people, the House of Representatives, with its members elected every 2 years to similarly sized districts, well, the founders wanted that body to have the primary responsibility for deciding how much we would be taxed and how our money would be spent. And so government funding, when done right, is supposed to be done with bills originally written in the House of Representatives, specifically in the 12 subcommittees in the House Appropriations Committee. The House Appropriations Committee has 12 subcommittees because our discretionary spending is divided into 12 categories. And so a proper appropriations process will produce 12 separate funding bills, 12 separate appropriations bills funding each category. And there is an appropriations subcommittee that is responsible for writing each of those bills. And so after the House and the Senate agree on the total amounts of money that they want to spend overall, the House Appropriations Committee's 12 subcommittees get to work. And the 12 committees are the Subcommittee on Agriculture, Rural Development, Food and Drug Administration. There's also a subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science. There's a subcommittee on Defense, which takes care of war and the spooks. There's a subcommittee on Energy and Water Development. And I do just want to make a note here, because I didn't actually know this, but the Department of Energy is not just in charge of, fossil fuels and wind and solar and nuclear energy. It's also in charge of our nuclear weapons, which I just find kind of interesting. There's also a subcommittee on financial services and general government, and this subcommittee is in charge of funding quite a bit. So it funds the Department of the Treasury, it funds the District of Columbia, as in Washington, D.C., which is not a normal city. It is a city controlled by Congress, and so it gets its funding from this subcommittee. This subcommittee also funds the judiciary and so many independent agencies like the Consumer Product Safety Commission, one of my favorite commissions, and the Federal Election Commission, and the Office of Government Ethics, which lately, I don't know what they do, but they do get funding, and the U.S. Postal Service. Even though I do have to note that the U.S. Postal Service is actually self-funding, so it doesn't get money from Congress every year. But if it needed it, this is the subcommittee that would take care of it. There's also the Subcommittee on Homeland Security, which funds the Department of Homeland Security, which, in case you're unaware, this is a department that did not exist before the W. Bush administration, and it took 22 separate agencies and smashed them all into one. So it's basically like a giant government merger, the Department of Homeland Security, and it houses things like the Customs and Border Patrol, it houses the Coast Guard, Immigration, Secret Service, 22 agencies in total. There's also the Subcommittee on Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies. So the Department of the Interior, that's like our national parks and public lands. EPA, we all know what that is. That is protecting our air and water, or at least trying to, but the Republicans really don't like it, so it's constantly being defunded. And this subcommittee is also funding our arts in our museums. So like this is where the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum gets its funding. It's where the Smithsonian Institution gets its funding, and a whole bunch of arts and cultural institutions like, the JFK Center for the Performing Arts. They're all getting their funding from Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies Subcommittee. There's also a subcommittee on Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education, which funds exactly what it sounds like it funds. There's also the subcommittee on Legislative Branch, which is what does the funding for the House of Representatives and the Senate and the Capitol Police. There's a subcommittee on Military Construction and Veterans Affairs, which I want to bring up because I consider this to be kind of a trick, because you have the one government funding bill that is for the Department of Defense, and then there's a separate one for Military Construction and Veterans Affairs. And I think that the existence of this really hides how much money we're spending on war. When you combine these two, which are both obviously related to war, we're spending about $1 trillion every year on war at this point. And I don't think these two should be separate, but they are. We also have a subcommittee on state and foreign operations. And so this is our diplomacy wing, or at least it's supposed to be our diplomacy wing, but it's the State Department that I have learned from reading so many government funding laws over the year. If there's going to be creepy, regime changey type of dingleberries stuck into a government funding law, I don't actually look in the War Department sections. I usually don't find these in defense or military construction or even the CIA. I find them in state. The State Department section is funding things like the National Endowment for Democracy. If you haven't heard that episode, you should really listen to it. It is amazing that this thing even exists. There's also the United States Agency for Global Media, which is a global propaganda machine. So yeah, most of the foreign policy creepy stuff, this is the section that I go to. It's the State and Foreign Operations section. And then finally, there's a subcommittee that's writing the bill for transportation and housing and urban development. So those 12 subcommittees create their 12 bills. And the voting process is that each committee, after writing the bill, is supposed to debate and pass it through their own committees. And after the bill passes the committee, it then goes to the House of Representatives floor for a vote with all 435 members. Now, when properly done, this should all be finished by around early summer so that the other members of the House can read it and submit amendments for things that they would like to change. There should be enough time for amendments to be debated and voted on by the full House, and then when that's done, the House of Representatives will vote on the entire finished funding bill. And the House needs to do this 12 times, and this should all be finished before they leave for their August summer vacation. After passing the House of Representatives, the 12 bills then move into the Senate. In the Senate, the funding bills then have two paths forward. One path leads right to the president's desk. And for a bill to go right to the president's desk, the Senate needs to pass the bill exactly as it was sent from the House of Representatives, with no changes at all. And this is because a bill can only become a law if it is passed by the House and the Senate, and the texts are 100% identical. Can't have so much as a comma in the wrong place. But if the Senate changes so much as a comma and passes the bill, then the bill has to take a different path, which is either back to the House of Representatives for another vote or to a conference committee. And a conference committee is when the House and Senate members come together to create a version of the bill that can pass both parts of Congress in identical form. And then that bill goes to both the House and the Senate, and then if it passes, goes to the president's desk to be signed. And all of this needs to be finished by September 30th, which is the end of the fiscal year. And I do not know what genius thought it was going to be a good idea to have the fiscal year be different from an actual year, but that is what it is. And so September 30th, that's the due date. And Congress has failed to pass all 12 bills on time every year since 1996. And so let's look at what happens when this process goes wrong, because usually it goes wrong. When Congress fails, as it does more often than not, one of two things happens on October 1st. The best case scenario is that the Congress passes a continuing resolution, which they nickname a CR. But it's continuing as in continuing the last year's funding levels. And so everyone in Washington calls these CRs, but anytime you hear CR, just think that they kicked their deadline. It's a way of saying the dog ate my homework, I need more time. And the thing about the CRs, they might sound harmless, but the agencies hate CRs. And the Defense Department in particular has been very vocal about hatred for CRs, and they have good reason. So here's Mike McCord. He was the Undersecretary of Defense. He's the comptroller, so he does all the money stuff. This was testimony from January 12th, 2022, as the House of Representatives was debating just having a CR for a full year because they couldn't get their shit together. And so this was his testimony to the House Committee on Appropriations Defense Subcommittee.
First, as I believe you are all aware, a full-year CR would reduce our funding level below what we requested and what we believe we need. On the surface, at the department level as a whole, the reduction to our accounts would appear to be about $8 billion below our request, which would be significant even if that was the only impact. The actual reduction in practice will be much greater because we would have significant funding that's misaligned, trapped, or frozen in the wrong places and unusable because we don't have the tools or flexibility to realign funds on anything like the scale we would need to fix all the problems that the chiefs are going to describe.
And on top of that, he said,
I know all of you are very familiar with the fact that virtually all military construction projects in each year's budget, including the FY22 budget, are new starts that cannot be executed under a CR.
And so CRs, these deadline kickers, they leave our government unable to legally adjust to unforeseen circumstances or even foreseen circumstances because they might see something coming in February and put a request in the budget. But as long as they're in a CR, they can't start new projects or sign new contracts. And that's something that sucks when we're talking about building new bathrooms in national parks. But it's straight dangerous when we're preventing the military from doing what it says it needs to do. They also can't stop funding projects or items that were funded in the prior year, even if they don't need them anymore, making for enormous wastes of money. But CRs are not the worst case scenario in frequent times of congressional failure. If Congress can't get a CR, that's when the government shuts down. Now, when I say the government shuts down, it's only the parts of the government that haven't been properly funded. And so everything that's funded with mandatory spending, Medicare, Social Security, all of that is fine, but it's the discretionary spending. All of the non-essential people that work in the agencies that are funded with discretionary spending, those are the ones that are furloughed. Those are the ones that are told, don't come to work until we get the money to pay you. Now, a lot of times the effects for us American citizens, we don't really feel them because essential public servants, they come to work anyway without pay, hoping they'll be back paid because that's what's happened in all of our previous shutdowns. In fact, this has become so frequent that in 2019, Congress made it a law that these people will be guaranteed back pay in the case of shutdowns. But the people we're talking about here are like air traffic controllers, border protection, active duty military. No matter what's happening with government funding, they show up to work whether their paychecks are showing up on time or not. But federal contractors, who are private sector workers paid to do work for the government, they're not guaranteed back pay and often don't get it. But as for us, normie peasants who aren't a part of the government just living our lives, there are some noticeable effects right away when the government shuts down. So, for example, museums and national parks that are funded by federal tax money, those close if the Interior Department isn't funded. There's also non-essential services, so those that are not related to public safety that are just stopped until funding is restored. So, for example, like IRS customer service agents, they are often furloughed. And this becomes a problem because the government funding deadline is September 30th, and there is a pretty major tax deadline on October 15th. And so for the 2 weeks before that, to be calling the IRS with a question and just getting a busy signal can be very, very frustrating for people. There's also people who are trying to get their Social Security numbers verified for loans and mortgages who are forced to wait, and that can sometimes screw up a normal person's ability to buy a home or even get a car. But then the effects become even more noticeable after a few weeks of a shutdown. This is when the employees all start to miss paychecks and it screws up their family finances. This is when Medicare checks are not issued and delivered, which really screws with our seniors. And this is when food stamps, which are funded via mandatory spending, but they're unable to be sent because the non-essential workers who physically send the food stamp cards, those people can't work, and so the money doesn't physically get sent out even though it's there. But this whole time, there's also less noticeable effects that are actually really, really important. So when the government shuts down, food and drug safety inspectors, they stop working. There's also user fees that are not collected by the government. There are federal permits and certifications that can't be issued, which stops private sector businesses from starting or continuing their work, which costs the government tax money. Non-essential workers furloughed get back pay without actually working, which all of these things are just enormous wastes of our tax money. And then finally, having dysfunction like this, have a government that's part open, part not, and all of the drama that goes along with this, it's just a national security threat. If another country wanted to attack us when we're weak during a government shutdown, is a really good time. We're lucky that it hasn't happened yet. And so the way out of a shutdown or out of a CR is to just fund the damn government. And that's when the buses arrive. In general, anytime there's a bus, something has gone wrong with funding in Congress. Because a bus means that the funding bills that weren't passed individually instead are being packaged together. And in my experience, they're often packaged behind closed doors by party leaders, skipping the committee process entirely. In fact, that's what's happening right now as I record this episode. But there are different kinds of government funding buses. So, sometimes you'll hear about an omnibus, as in an everything bus, which is all 12 bills smashed into one. And these can be just offensively long. For example, the omnibus that funded the government during COVID for 2021 was over 5,500 pages long, and people were given just a couple of days to look through it. It was literally impossible for everyone to read. But then sometimes there are certain bills that make it into law on time and other ones that are not, and that's when you'll get a minibus, which is some but not all of the appropriations bills. And then there's other dumb bus names, like I remember the Cromnibus, which is when they combined a CR with an omnibus in one bill. See what they did there? A CR omnibus, the Cromnibus. Now, it's dumb because it actually wasn't an omnibus because it didn't fund everything, which is why they needed a CR, because the CR had to kick the deadline for the work they didn't finish. But, they liked the nickname Cromnibus, aren't we clever? And so accuracy in that label wasn't important to the DC brains, but you get the point. All of these buses are signs of congressional failure and dysfunction. And sometimes as these buses are going full speed towards becoming law before anyone can even check them out, sometimes they do some loop-de-loops around the Constitution to make that happen. Because sometimes the buses come from the Senate, which, you will recall, is not what the Constitution says should happen. The Constitution says that all funding bills are supposed to begin in the House. But if it's the Senate that wants to drive the bus, what they'll do is they'll take a bill, usually some uncontroversial nothing burger, and either add their government funding bill or bus to it, or they'll delete the text of the original bill and replace it with the Senate's government funding. And so, this is why sometimes I'll link to a bill in the show notes that funds the government, but the title will be something like the Veterans Community Care Act, or Freedom for Fetuses, or the COFEFI Act. That was a real thing. But when you see that, when I link to a bill and the title seems wrong, that's often because they are using a random bill that passed the House already as a vehicle to drive the Senate's funding bus around the Constitution. But regardless of where the government funding buses are built, they always carry dingleberries, as in shit that gets attached to the must-sign funding bills and hitchhike their way into law. And one form of dingleberry are earmarks, which are all kinds of goodies that members of Congress attach to government funding that will make it more likely that they'll vote for the full government funding bill or package because something is going specifically to their home district. A great example of this was the bridge to nowhere in Alaska, because this was an earmark that pissed a lot of people off during the W. Bush years, and it actually became a pretty big part of the 2008 presidential campaign. But the bridge, which was supposed to be nearly as long as the Golden Gate Bridge and as tall as the Brooklyn Bridge, was intended to connect the town of Ketchikan. Sorry, Alaska, if I don't know how to say that, but it's some nowhere town in Alaska, which had about 8,000 or so residents. And it was supposed to attach that town to Gravina Island, which was home to 50 people and was the location of an airport. The bridge was proposed in order to replace a ferry ride, which took a whole 7 minutes, and which was doing just fine handling all of the necessary traffic. But that project, that bridge, was estimated to cost $398 million. And people saw that and said, why are we spending that much money on a bridge to nowhere for so few people that don't need it? And so in the aftermath of the bridge to nowhere drama, which was never built, by the way, the Republicans in charge of the House of Representatives, when I started this podcast back in the Obama years, they banned earmarks for 10 years. But those 10 years have gone by, and so now earmarks are back. But they're back with a different name since the label earmark is politically toxic. And so they've brought back earmarks as, quote, congressionally directed spending, unquote, which, to be fair, is a more clear and accurate description of what they are. But these dingleberries get projects built in individual districts and get members of Congress to vote to fund the government when not doing so would mean refusing funding for specific projects in the locations they represent. But just get ready for stories about all kinds of things that are being funded that I'm sure will be branded as wasteful spending because members of Congress are getting these attached to funding bills by the hundreds. But that's not necessarily bad. There are important projects that will be funded this way, even if some of them will be branded as wasteful and are controversial. But to these local communities, they could be really important. But there are other dingleberries that are straight up controversial and get included in omnibus funding bills in order to become law as dirty little secrets under the cover of thousands of pages that no one has time to read before the votes. And we've seen all kinds of dirty dingleberries during the era of Congressional Dish. Like the dingleberry that legalized bank bailouts of both foreign and domestic banks. Or the treaty with Mexico that was approved via dingleberry that opened up huge parts of the Gulf of Mexico to deepwater oil drilling not long after the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And we routinely see things like spying provisions and other provisions from like the Patriot Act being renewed without any debate. And of course, there are so many corporate favors. And that's actually why I think there's no real incentive or attempt by the leaders of either party to fix the clearly broken appropriations process. Because they can get things into law that benefit their corporate donors that would be controversial and much harder to pass on their own. Dysfunction in Congress has become a tactic. And with voters continuing to send the same people back to Congress to represent them, us, over and over again, well, with no accountability for breaking the funding process, why would they fix it? And so that's how it works more often than not. I have yet to see a proper government funding process as the host of Congressional Dish. But what I can tell you is if you're ever curious about where Congress is in this process, you can always check the status of the appropriations process on the House Appropriations Committee website. They actually have a really easy to understand chart, and it goes back many years, and you can see the status of each of the 12 bills. And real quick, I will give you an update on where we are in real time. Right now, as I record this on it is March 5th, 2024. And right now, all 12 government funding bills have not been passed into law. And they did something weird this time, which is that they split them up. So there's 2 different deadlines. There are 4 of the bills that are due on March 8th, and there are 8 bills that are due on March 22nd. As of right now, there appears to be a bill that has a good chance of becoming law. This is going to be a minibus with 6 out of the 12 funding bills attached to it. The ones that seem to be ready to go are the Agriculture/FDA, Commerce, Justice, Science, Energy and Water, Interior, and the EPA, Military, Construction, Veterans, and Transportation and Housing. Those 6 bills will be packaged together, and there are 605 pages of earmarks in this minibus. Ooh, boy. But if it passes and there is a shutdown later this month, national parks and museums at least will still be open because Interior is funded in the minibus. But a shutdown is very much possible on March 22nd, the second deadline, because they've saved all the hard bills for last. So like Department of Defense, Department of State, which is war money. We know that we have Israel and Ukraine. There are very controversial things happening in that regard right now. That's also the minibus that would be funding the Department of Homeland Security in the middle of a giant border and immigration debate. And so if we're going to have a shutdown, March 22nd, that's the drama date. And so now you know all of the terms and what to look for. And you can follow the news on this on your own, and I will let you know what becomes law if and when it happens. Thank you for listening to and sharing this episode. I know this can be a little bit dry, this government funding stuff, but it's really important to understand how it works. And so I appreciate you listening to this and sharing it with other people who need to know. I also appreciate you paying for the show. And if you haven't already, please go to the Support the Show page on congressionaldish.com and pay whatever you think is fair. But I also want to let you know that I have decided to be a little bit more active in the Congressional Dish way on my social media pages. I've long been active on Twitter. I know it's called X now, but I don't care. But I've always been active on Twitter at Jen Briney. And we also have a Congressional Dish account there too at Congress Dish. But I personally control the at Jen Briney. But I've also been having a lot of fun with the stories on Instagram. So I'm also at Jen Briney on Instagram as well. There's also a Congressional Dish account there. But the reason that I bring this up is that since I started this show, I kind of compartmentalized my social media. I really had my Facebook page locked down. I never used it for work because that was my way of communicating with basically my boomer relatives and random people from high school. But over the years, just going to all the podcasting conferences and stuff like that, my Facebook feed is already full of people who I can't remember. And I also know that there's a lot of people that still use Facebook. I'm not one of them, but I know a lot of other people do. And so what I decided to do was link my Instagram account to Facebook. And that way people can see updates to Congressional Dish episodes in my stories. So when I see, for instance, I just did an episode on the war money and made the case that I think what's happening in Israel is a land grab. I think that's why they're flattening Gaza. And so in my stories, when I see more evidence of that, that's where I'm putting that information. And so if you want to follow along and get kind of those real-time updates on the stories that I've covered on this podcast, please go and follow me on Facebook or Instagram. Again, it's Jennifer Briney at Jen Briney in those locations. We also have a Congressional Dish TikTok. But yeah, I'd really like some social media follows also because my lack of caring about social media has definitely hurt the show. Because when people look to me as like, oh, I want to see if I'm going to have this person as a guest, when they see that I only have I think I have 1,800 Instagram followers. It's not representative of the size of my podcast audience, but there is no public number for that. So it looks like I'm an amateur, like I'm a newbie. So even if you don't give a shit about anything that I have to say on social media, if you want to just follow me, just so I can get that number up, it's not an ego thing, although maybe it's kind of an ego thing. I don't know, but it does hurt the show when people are looking to see if I'm someone that they want to have on theirs. This whole social media life is just not one that I was meant for. I love producing the show, but advertising it is just not my thing. And so, if you can help me as my Congressional Dish marketing team by following all those accounts and by sharing the things that you think are worth sharing, that would be very much appreciated because marketing it's not my thing. My thing is reading bills. My thing is watching hearings. Trying to get attention on the internet, just not my thing. But before I get back to my actual thing and go back to finding out what Congress is doing with all this funding, I would like to take a second and thank some of our new executive producers. If you are new to the Congressional Dish universe, executive producers are the people that have contributed enough money to have contributed significantly to the production of an episode. The number we have set to become an executive producer is $535, and you can either provide that in one lump sum or over time, cumulatively. But every time you hit $535, you get the opportunity to put your name as an executive producer on an episode, which lends your vouch to that episode and moves it up the most valuable episodes list. On congressionaldish.com, I got the question for so many years, what episodes do you recommend? Well, I produced all of them. And honestly, a lot of times I produce these episodes and then I forget that I did them. So I'm not the person to ask because I'm on to the next subject. But I felt like the people who have invested in this show should be the people that are determining what the best episodes are. And so that's what the most valuable episodes list is. The episodes that are at the top are the ones with the most executive producers. And so every time you put your name on an episode, it moves that episode up the list. And today I would like to thank 3 people who are executive producers. One is a 4-time executive producer, Michael Constantino, and his executive producer request is going to go on Congressional Dish 283, which I can't remember what episode that was. Let's find out. 283 was the episode about the possible Federal Reserve digital dollar, a CBDC, and the hearing that took place in Congress discussing whether or not that's a good idea. But what Michael said was, quote, "How I typically do these is that I put my name on the one I am currently listening to or the next one you do. I've been listening for a long time and trust in the quality of the product you put out. And so for my next credit, I will be on the next pod you make. Love the work you do. Hope you and your family are doing great. And I hope you enjoy your next place you stay in your digital nomad life." Well, thank you, Michael. We are actually stationary in Austin for a little bit. But when it comes to that episode, I think that's a great episode. And I think it's one that we need to be aware of because the Federal Reserve is thinking about creating a form of digital money. And it was kind of a complicated debate. And so I'm happy that I know where it is and the details of it. And I think, they're debating the nature of money. It's kind of a big deal. And so I do like that there's an executive producer credit on that episode. So thank you, Michael. You're very much appreciated. Another executive producer whose name I have long known is Kevin Carney, and his executive producer credit is going to go on what is currently the #1 most popular episode of Congressional Dish, 266, Contriving January 6th. That episode is where I watched every single minute of the January 6th committee's work where they investigated not only what happened on January 6, 2021 with the riot and stuff, but what happened the 2 months before. So that's really where I learned about Trump's scheme to get fake election documents created in 7 states saying that he won the election when he didn't. And what was going on actual January 6th is that he was trying to get Mike Pence to use those fake documents to say he was president, to either make him president or throw the election into enough chaos that the House of Representatives would vote, where in theory, he had enough Republicans there to make him president. So it was a pretty crazy, complicated plan to remain president, but I didn't fully understand it until I watched every minute of the January 6th committee. And so what I did is I took 20 hours of testimony and I broke it up by topic. So you can really get 20 hours of testimony in about 2 hours. And I honestly think it's some of the best work I've ever done. So thank you for putting another executive producer credit on that episode. I think it deserves to be #1. And then finally, we have Joshua Zook, who is now going to be our executive producer on episode 167, Combating Russia, which was also a very popular episode. And he said, quote, "I wanted Congressional Dish 167, Combating Russia, to get my EP credit because it was one of the first episodes I listened to and the first one that made me realize that Congressional Dish is valuable in ways that other podcasts are not. The level of detail that you are able to go into in such a concise and easily digestible manner, along with backing up everything you say with sources that anyone can check for themselves, makes Congressional Dish a unique and valuable resource. The reason I want number 167 in particular to get my EP credit is that this episode completely changed my outlook on America's role in the world. I had opposed the Iraq War and I had nebulous ideas about the US government helping out rich people at the expense of the rest of us. But this episode made all these nebulous ideas click into place and helped me see the bigger picture of what the US government has done and continues to do in the world. So thank you." Unquote. Well, thank you, Joshua, for putting your name on that episode. That is also one of my favorite episodes. And I think for anyone who's curious about Ukraine in particular, in the last episode, in the War Money episode, I discussed Ukraine and I just kind of dropped the history in there because I feel like I've talked about it a lot. But Ukraine has been dependent on our government since 2014. And if you really want that backstory, I think episode 167 is where I did the best job in explaining what happened 10 years ago. So thank you for putting your name on that and moving it further up the list. And thank you to all our executive producers and producers at any level. I say this all the time, but it's so true. I would not still be doing this without you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Claire, for doing such a beautiful job with the show notes. Claire is my assistant. Thank you to Mike, my editor. Thank you to Mark, who does the website security. Thank you to my sister, who compiles all of these executive producer credits. And by the way, if you are curious about your progress towards an executive producer credit, we do keep track. Just go ahead and email Lauren@congressionaldish.com and she will let you know where you're at because she keeps track of all of it. She's my best friend and my accountant. And thank you to my husband, Joe, for putting up with me, and my dad, who has been my business coach for this entire time. And thank you to you. You are the most important person here because if you weren't listening, I wouldn't have a show. I wouldn't have a career. This wouldn't exist. So thank you for listening. And yeah, I'm happy to still be doing this. All right. We'll see what happens with government funding. I will talk to you when I talk to you. Take care. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.